The screech of tires pierced the quiet afternoon, followed by the sickening crunch of metal against concrete. Time seemed to slow as the black SUV spun out of control, flipping onto its roof with a thunderous crash. Glass shattered across the asphalt, glinting like diamonds in the harsh summer sun. The intersection, usually busy with afternoon traffic, fell into an eerie silence broken only by the gentle hiss of steam rising from the mangled vehicle. Malik Thompson stood frozen on the sidewalk, his heart pounding against his ribs. Others gathered too, their phones raised to capture the scene, but no one moved to help. Then he heard it, a sound that cut through the paralysis of shock, a baby's cry, desperate and afraid, coming from inside the overturned car. Someone called 911, a woman screamed from the gathering crowd, but still, no one moved forward. The cry came again, more urgent this time, and something inside Malik snapped. Without thinking, he dropped his worn backpack and ran toward the wreck. The closer he got, the stronger the smell of gasoline became. Through the shattered window, he could see a baby car seat, partially suspended, with a small figure strapped inside. The driver, a woman in a suit, hung motionless against her seatbelt, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. "Help me," Malik shouted back to the crowd, but their faces remained frozen in horror. His hands trembled as he grabbed the door handle, pulling with all his strength. The metal groaned in protest, sharp edges cutting into his palms, but he didn't feel the pain. All he could focus on was the baby's cries and the growing puddle of gasoline beneath the car. Finally, the door gave way. Malik crawled inside, glass crunching beneath his knees. The baby's face was red from crying, tears streaming down chubby cheeks. With shaking fingers, he worked at the car seat buckles, speaking softly, "It's okay, little one. I've got you. You're going to be okay." The sound of distant sirens filled the air as Malik finally freed the baby, cradling the tiny body against his chest. He backed out of the wreck carefully, his heart still racing. As he stood up, clutching his precious cargo, he noticed the mansion at the end of the street. Without hesitation, he started running. He didn't know it then, but those next few steps would change not only his life, but the lives of everyone around him forever. Experience powerful storytelling that moves your heart. Don't miss out. Subscribe now to unlock more emotional journeys that will change you forever. The small apartment on Cedar Street was barely big enough for 4 people, but somehow Malik Thompson and his family made it work. Every morning before dawn, Sarah Thompson would quietly slip out of the cramped bedroom she shared with her 3 children, careful not to wake them as she prepared for another grueling 16-hour shift split between the hospital cafeteria and a local diner. Malik, at 15, had become the family's second parent by necessity. His mother's tired eyes and worn hands told the story of years of struggle since their father had walked out, leaving them with nothing but unpaid bills and broken promises. The responsibility sat heavy on Malik's young shoulders as he made sure 8-year-old Emily and 6-year-old Tommy were fed, dressed, and ready for school each day. Their home was a patchwork of makeshift solutions. The kitchen cabinet doors hung by single hinges, the refrigerator hummed too loudly, and the windows were sealed with duct tape to keep out the winter drafts. But Sarah had done her best to make it feel like home. Emily's drawings covered the walls, and Tommy's small collection of rescued toy cars lined the windowsill. The financial strain was a constant presence. Like another member of the family, they couldn't escape. Bills piled up on the kitchen counter, their red final notice stamps a recurring nightmare. Malik had learned to water down the milk to make it last longer, to cut each slice of bread a little thinner, to tell his siblings that Mom was just resting her eyes when she fell asleep at the dinner table, still in her work uniform. Sarah's determination was their family's foundation. Despite working double shifts, she never failed to leave little notes in their lunch bag. "Study hard. My brave boy for Malik, shine bright. My little artist for Emily, and be kind. My sweet Tommy for her youngest." These small gestures of love kept them going through the hardest days. Malik had inherited his mother's resilience. After school, while other kids played basketball or went to the mall, he would search the neighborhood for odd jobs mowing lawns, carrying groceries for elderly neighbors, anything to earn a few extra dollars. Every penny he earned went straight into the family's emergency jar, hidden behind the rusty toaster. The siblings had formed their own support system. Emily would help Tommy with his reading, sounding out words from their shared, second-hand school books. Tommy would make them all laugh with his silly impressions, his special talent for lightening even the darkest moods. And Malik would tell them stories before bed, spinning tales of better days to come, of a future where their mom wouldn't have to work so hard, where they could buy new shoes before the old ones got holes. Their neighborhood was a tight-knit community of similar struggles. Mrs. Rodriguez next door would watch the kids when Sarah worked late. Mr. Chen from the corner store sometimes slipped extra fruit into their grocery bags, refusing payment with a knowing smile. They weren't the only family fighting to keep their heads above water, but they were among the most determined. Every night, after the younger ones were asleep, Malik would often find his mother at the kitchen table, bills spread out before her, calculator in hand. He'd make her a cup of tea, reusing the same tea bag from morning, and sit with her in silence, their shared burden weighing heavily in the quiet hours. "We'll be okay, Ma," he'd say. And though uncertainty clouded his heart, his voice never wavered. Sarah would squeeze his hand, her calloused fingers warm against his, and whisper, "I know, baby, I know." This was their life, a delicate balance of love and hardship, of dreams deferred and hope preserved. Until the day of the crash, they had managed to keep their small world turning through sheer determination and the fierce love that bound them together. None of them could have known that their lives were about to change dramatically, that their story of quiet struggle was about to intersect with a world they had only glimpsed through the windows of passing cars. Behind the wrought iron gates of 1147 Highland Avenue stood Hastings Manor, a testament to generational wealth and privilege. William Hastings had built his fortune in real estate development, transforming the city's skyline with gleaming towers that bore his name. But within the mansion's perfectly maintained walls, tensions simmered beneath a veneer of family perfection. William Hastings was a man accustomed to control. His silver hair was always impeccably styled, his suits custom-tailored, his demeanor carefully measured. Yet lately, worry lines had begun to crease his forehead as he watched his eldest son, Andrew, spiral further from the path he'd planned. At 25, Andrew had already been pulled out of 3 prestigious colleges, his name kept out of tabloids through generous donations and careful public relations. Martha Hastings, elegant and refined, carried herself with the grace of old money, though she'd married into it. She spent her days managing charity galas and social events, but her true focus remained on her youngest son, Michael, just 9 months old. The baby had been a surprise late in life, a gift she'd feared would never come. His arrival had shifted the family's dynamics in ways that grew more complex by the day. Andrew's resentment toward his baby brother was poorly concealed. Before Michael's birth, he had been the sole heir to the Hastings fortune, secure in his position despite his failings. Now, watching his parents dote on the infant, his grip on that future felt increasingly uncertain. The servants whispered about his late-night outbursts, the broken objects discovered in the morning, the way he would stare at Michael's nursery with cold, calculating eyes. William had tried everything to guide his eldest son: tough love, financial incentives, threats of disinheritance, but nothing seemed to penetrate Andrew's sense of entitlement. The young man moved through life as if it owed him everything, his handsome features twisted by an ever-present sneer. But his recent return home, claiming a desire to learn the family business, had set William's instincts on high alert. Martha noticed the tension between father and son, but chose to focus on maintaining peace. She arranged family dinners where conversation stayed carefully superficial, hired more security staff without explicitly acknowledging why, and spent increasing amounts of time in the nursery with Michael, as if her presence alone could protect him from the undercurrents of discord. The baby, Michael, remained blissfully unaware of the dynamics swirling around him. His sunny disposition and ready smile had charmed everyone in the household except his brother. Even the staff, typically reserved and professional, couldn't resist cooing at him during their duties. His nursery, a pristine space filled with every luxury an infant could want, sat at the heart of the mansion, much like the child himself had become the heart of his parents' world. William often stood at his office window, watching Andrew pace the grounds like a caged animal, and wondered where he had gone wrong. His own father had built their fortune from nothing, instilling values of hard work and responsibility. Somehow, those lessons had failed to take root in Andrew, despite William's best efforts to replicate his father's teachings. The household staff moved carefully through their duties, aware of the precarious balance within the family. They had witnessed Andrew's tantrums, heard his late-night arguments with William, seen the way he dismissed his mother's attempts at reconciliation. They shared concerned glances when he would return home in the early hours, reeking of expensive whiskey and entitlement. Martha tried to bridge the growing divide, organizing family portraits where they all smiled perfectly for the camera, maintaining the illusion of harmony. But at night, she would hold Michael close, singing soft lullabies while tears rolled down her cheeks. She knew, deep down, that something would have to give. The pressure was building, and she feared what form the inevitable explosion might take. None of them could have predicted that their carefully constructed world would be shaken to its core by a teenager from the wrong side of town, or that their family's salvation would come from the most unexpected source. The day of the crash was approaching, and with it, a chain of events that would strip away their facades and force them to confront the truth about themselves and each other. Cedar Street and Highland Avenue existed in the same city but might as well have been different planets. Between them lay an invisible line, drawn by decades of economic disparity and social prejudice. On one side, crumbling apartment buildings and corner stores with barred windows; on the other, manicured lawns and private security patrols. Old Robert Anderson, who had tended the Hastings Gardens for over 30 years, was perhaps the only person who regularly crossed this divide. His weathered hands had shaped the estate's pristine hedges, while his eyes observed the growing gap between the two worlds. He remembered when the neighborhood children would press their faces against the iron gates, dreaming of what lay beyond before increased security measures drove them away. The local community center, once a bridge between the neighborhoods, now stood abandoned, its windows boarded up after budget cuts eliminated its programs. The wealthy residents had their country clubs and private gyms; the working-class families had the streets and overcrowded public parks. Children from both sides attended different schools, shopped at different stores, lived entirely separate lives mere blocks apart. When the Hastings' new tower rose downtown, it cast literal shadows over the older buildings below. The construction had displaced several small businesses, including the diner where Sarah Thompson had once worked extra shifts. The community's protests had fallen on deaf ears, their voices drowned out by promises of progress and prosperity that never seemed to reach their street. Rumors and judgments flowed freely across the divide. The wealthy residents spoke of crime rates and property values, while Cedar Street families whispered about corruption and greed. Each side had crafted narratives about the other, stories passed down and reinforced through generations of separation. The police patrolled differently on either side of the line. On Highland Avenue, they were courteous guardians; on Cedar Street, they were suspicious observers. The same officer who would wave cheerfully at the Hastings security team might stop and question Malik for walking home after dark. Local businesses reflected the disparity. The gourmet market on Highland Avenue displayed fresh organic produce and imported delicacies, while the corner store on Cedar Street stocked dented cans and day-old bread. The price difference between a gallon of milk at each location could represent an hour's wages for families like the Thompsons. Churches and community groups tried to bridge the gap, organizing food drives and charity events, but these often reinforced the divide rather than narrowing it. The wealthy arrived in luxury cars to donate their children's outgrown designer clothes, while working families swallowed their pride to accept hand-me-downs they couldn't afford to refuse. Robert watched it all from his unique vantage point, tending the Hastings roses while keeping an eye on the street beyond the gates. He saw the potential in kids like Malik, recognized the same determination he'd had as a young man. Sometimes, when no one was watching, he would leave the garden gate unlocked, creating small opportunities for those brave enough to seek them. The city council meetings told the story clearly enough. Highland Avenue residents arrived in suits, their concerns about property taxes and zoning laws given serious consideration. Cedar Street representatives, when they could attend, raised issues about public transportation and affordable housing, their voices often lost in bureaucratic procedures they hadn't been educated to navigate. Yet beneath these divisions, human stories unfolded. Children from both sides dreamed similar dreams, parents worried about their futures, and everyone searched for their place in the world. All it would take was one moment, one brave action, to begin bridging this divide. That moment was coming, though none of them knew it yet. The morning after the crash dawned with a swirl of activity around Cedar Street. Police cars lined the sidewalks, their lights casting red and blue shadows across worn brick buildings. Detective James Miller stood in front of the Thompsons' apartment, his notebook open, watching Malik demonstrate how he'd pulled the baby from the wreckage. "And you didn't hesitate," the detective asked, his pen hovering above the paper, "even with the gasoline leak?" Malik shifted uncomfortably under the officer's scrutiny. "No, sir. I just heard the baby crying. I couldn't just stand there." Sarah stood behind her son, her hand protective on his shoulder, still wearing her diner uniform from the night shift she hadn't been able to leave early. News vans had begun appearing at the intersection, reporters clutching microphones and speaking in hushed, excited tones about the heroic rescue. Their cameras turned toward the Hastings mansion, then back to the modest apartment building where Malik lived, the contrast making their story's angle obvious. "My son did what anyone would do," Sarah insisted, though they all knew that wasn't true. The crowd of onlookers had stood frozen, phones recording while Malik had acted. The footage, shaky and dramatic, had already gone viral overnight. Inside the Hastings mansion, the atmosphere was equally charged. William Hastings paced his study, phone pressed to his ear as his legal team advised caution. "We need to control the narrative," his lawyer urged. A public statement, carefully worded. "We can't have this boy's family thinking they can exploit the situation." Martha cradled Michael in the nursery, her hands trembling as she remembered how close she'd come to losing him. The baby's regular sitter had called in sick, forcing her to leave him with a new agency nurse for a charity board meeting. The nurse, now in critical condition at City Memorial, had apparently suffered a seizure while driving. Andrew Hastings watched the media circus from his bedroom window, his jaw clenched. He'd returned home at dawn to find the house in chaos, his chance to prove himself to his father overshadowed by some kid from the wrong side of town. His hangover pounded behind his eyes as reporters shouted questions at the gates. Robert Anderson went about his gardening duties, carefully pruning roses while observing the commotion. He'd seen Malik around the neighborhood, noticed his quiet determination, the way he helped his siblings and did odd jobs without complaint. Now he watched as the boy's life became a media spectacle, knowing how quickly such attention could turn sour. The local morning news was already running with the story "Teenager Risks Life to Save Millionaire's Baby." They played the rescue footage on loop, intercut with shots of the economic divide between Cedar Street and Highland Avenue. Social media exploded with comments, some praising Malik's bravery, others questioning his motives. Mrs. Rodriguez from next door fought her way through reporters to bring the Thompsons a homemade casserole. "They're vultures," she muttered, glaring at the news vans. "They don't care about Malik, just their stories." She hugged Sarah, whispering encouragement, while Emily and Tommy peeked wide-eyed through the window at the crowd below. Detective Miller finished his interview, closing his notebook with a snap. "You did good, kid," he said quietly, away from the cameras. "But watch yourself. Stories like this, they have a way of getting complicated." He handed Sarah his card before pushing through the gathering crowd. By afternoon, the school had called, requesting interviews about their heroic student. Local politicians sensed an opportunity, their offices reaching out to arrange photo ops. Malik sat at the kitchen table, his bandaged hands cradled around a cup of tea, wondering how a simple act of human decency had spiraled into such chaos. Sarah watched her son, pride warring with worry in her heart. She'd raised him to help others, to be brave and kind, but she hadn't prepared him for this kind of attention. She couldn't protect him from what was coming, could only stand beside him and hope that the world would see him for who he truly was, not a story, not a symbol, but a boy who'd done the right thing without thinking twice. William Hastings sat behind his mahogany desk, studying Malik with an intensity that made the boy conscious of his worn sneakers and second-hand clothes. The office, with its leather-bound books and oil paintings, felt like another world compared to the small apartment where Malik had grown up. "I want to offer you a position here," William said finally, his voice measured, "working in the gardens with Robert. It's honest work, and you'll be fairly compensated." He named a figure that made Malik's heart skip, more money than his mother made in a week at the diner. But pride warred with necessity in Malik's chest. "Sir, I appreciate the offer, but I don't want charity. What I didn't do it for money." His hands, still bandaged from the rescue, twisted in his lap. From the doorway, Andrew Hastings watched the exchange, his face a mask of barely concealed contempt. "Father, you can't seriously be considering hiring him. We have an employment agency for this sort of thing." The words dripped with disdain. William silenced his son with a look. "This isn't charity, Malik. This is an opportunity, one you've earned through your actions. But it will be real work, and I'll expect real results." That evening, as Malik helped Robert learn the grounds, Andrew appeared among the rose bushes. "Listen carefully," he hissed, checking to ensure they were alone. "You might have fooled my father with your hero act, but I'm watching you. One mistake, one missing item, and you're done." Robert, overhearing, stepped between them. "Mr. Andrew, the roses need attention near the fountain." His voice was respectful but firm. Once Andrew had stalked away, Robert turned to Malik. "Don't let him get to you, son. Just do your work and keep your head down." The first week tested Malik's resolve. His muscles ached from unfamiliar labor, and Andrew's constant surveillance made every task feel like walking through a minefield. But the thought of the electric bill, of his mother's exhausted face, kept him going. Some of the other staff viewed him with suspicion, whispering when they thought he couldn't hear. "It's just for publicity," one maid muttered. "Once the media attention dies down, they'll let him go." Others were kinder, slipping him bottles of water during hot afternoons. Martha Hastings would watch from the nursery window as Malik worked, Michael cooing in her arms. Sometimes she'd bring lemonade out to the garden, her kindness genuine but awkward, as if she wasn't quite sure how to interact with someone from his world. The media continued to circle, though more distantly now. "Local hero takes job with family he saved," read one headline. From rescue to rags to riches, questioned another. Malik ignored them all, focusing on learning every plant, every task Robert taught him. William watched too, from his study window. He saw Malik's dedication, the care he took with each task, the way he arrived early and stayed late. But he also saw Andrew's growing resentment, the way his elder son seemed to darken with each passing day. At home, Malik's siblings peppered him with questions about the mansion. "Did you see any princesses?" Emily would ask. "Are there really gold toilets?" Tommy wondered. Malik just smiled, saving his first paycheck as a surprise for their mother. Sarah worried, of course. "Be careful, baby," she'd say each morning. Rich people's worlds. They play by different rules, but she couldn't deny the pride she felt seeing her son rise early, determined to earn his way. Robert became Malik's quiet ally, teaching him more than just gardening. "Notice how the light hits different parts of the garden," he'd say. "Everything grows better when it's in the right place." His lessons seemed to extend beyond just plants. By the end of the first month, Malik had earned his place among the ground staff. His hands had toughened, his knowledge had grown, and even some of the initial skeptics had warmed to his quiet determination. But Andrew's hostility only intensified, and storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, though none of them could see them yet. The first paycheck felt almost unreal in Malik's hands. He stood in line at the utility company, heart pounding as he handed over the money for the electric bill. The clerk's expression softened when she stamped "paid." Across the final notice, having seen Sarah Thompson struggle with partial payments for months. Back at home, the changes were subtle but significant. The refrigerator hummed with fresh groceries, no longer half empty. Emily and Tommy no longer had to wear extra sweaters indoors because they could afford to run the heat. Sarah's face showed less strain, though she still worked her shifts at the diner, refusing to rely solely on Malik's income. One evening, William Hastings called Malik to his study. On the desk sat a collection of children's books, their covers bright and unblemished. "Martha picked these out," William explained, watching Malik's expression carefully. "For your siblings. Every child should have books of their own." The gesture's kindness nearly brought tears to Malik's eyes. That night, Emily and Tommy sat wide-eyed on their shared bed as Malik read to them from their very first new books. Their mother leaned against the doorframe, watching her children's faces light up at the stories, her own eyes glistening. These moments of joy had been rare in their household, making them all the more precious now. The apartment began to transform in small ways. A fresh coat of paint brightened the walls, paid for with Malik's earnings. New curtains replaced the old sheets they'd been using. Sarah splurged on a small potted plant, placing it proudly on the windowsill, a touch of the garden Malik now tended coming into their home. Robert took special pride in Malik's progress, teaching him not just about plants but about life. "See how these roses need pruning," he'd say. "Sometimes cutting back helps new growth flourish." He'd slip Malik extra seedlings to take home, helping the boy start a small container garden on their apartment's fire escape. The neighborhood noticed the changes too. Mrs. Rodriguez smiled more warmly when she saw Malik heading to work each morning. Mr. Chen at the corner store stopped slipping extra items into their bags, knowing they could now afford to pay their way. There was dignity in this new stability, hard-earned and precious. Even at school, things shifted. Malik's grades improved as the constant stress of survival eased. His teachers noticed his renewed focus, the way he stayed after class to catch up on work he'd missed during harder times. The guidance counselor started talking about college possibilities, no longer seeming like an impossible dream. Sarah began keeping a small journal, recording these changes like precious memories. "Today, Tommy got new shoes," she wrote. "First time we didn't have to wait for a sale, and later Emily joined the art club. We could afford the supplies." Each entry marked another small victory over the poverty that had defined their lives for so long. The garden became Malik's sanctuary, a place where hope grew alongside the flowers he tended. He learned each plant's needs, understanding that growth takes time and patience. Some evenings he'd bring home flowers that were about to be discarded, placing them in a jar on their kitchen table, a splash of beauty in their once bare apartment. Little did they know that this period of peace was temporary, that the seeds of trouble were already taking root in Andrew's jealous heart. But for now they allowed themselves to enjoy these moments of brightness, this taste of what life could be when worry didn't overshadow every decision. Hope, like the first green shoots of spring, had begun to emerge in their lives, fragile but determined to grow. Andrew Hastings sat in his darkened BMW, watching Malik leave the estate one evening. His fingers drummed against the leather steering wheel as he took another sip from his crystal flask. 3 months had passed since the hero, He had joined their household staff, and with each passing day, Andrew's resentment festered like a wound. His father's changing attitude was unbearable. William had begun mentioning Malik in conversations about the future, praising his work ethic, his character, his potential. That boy understands the value of hard work. William had said at dinner recently, his eyes flickering meaningfully toward Andrew. He reminds me of my father, starting from nothing. The plan had formed slowly, meticulously. Andrew had spent weeks observing patterns, noting schedules and gathering materials. Martha's prized sapphire necklace, a wedding anniversary gift from William, would be perfect. It was small enough to plant, valuable enough to matter, and its emotional significance would ensure swift, severe consequences. He started small at first, setting the stage. A few expensive items went missing from the garden shed, tools that could be pawned. Security reports were filed, creating a pattern. Andrew made sure to mention concerns about recent thefts. Within earshot of the household staff, planting seeds of suspicion. The whispers began circulating among the servants. Items had gone missing before, but now there was a convenient suspect. Some remembered how Malik had studied the house's layout during his first weeks, how he seemed to know the family's schedules. The fact that these observations were innocent didn't matter. Context could poison anything. Robert noticed the changing atmosphere. He saw how other staff members began checking their belongings more carefully when Malik was nearby, how security guards watched him more closely. He tried to warn the boy without alarming him. "Keep your head up, son. Not everyone's got your best interests at heart." One Tuesday evening, Andrew made his move. He waited until Malik was working late, helping Robert prepare the garden for an upcoming charity event. The security cameras in the East Wing had a 3-minute blind spot during shift changes, a detail he'd learned during his own late-night adventures. Moving quickly, Andrew slipped into his mother's dressing room. The necklace lay in its velvet box, sapphires gleaming in the dim light. With gloved hands, he carefully placed it in a small cloth bag. His heart raced, not with guilt but with anticipation. This would solve everything. The garden shed was unlocked. Malik always left it open while working nearby. Andrew's shoes made no sound on the dirt floor as he moved between the tools and supplies. He found Malik's old backpack hanging on a peg, the same one he'd dropped when rushing to save Michael. The irony wasn't lost on Andrew as he slipped the necklace into its worn front pocket. On that night, Andrew sat in his father's study, nursing a scotch. "I hate to bring this up," he began, voice carefully modulated to show concern. "But Mother's sapphire necklace, have you seen it recently?" The question landed like a stone in still water, ripples of consequence already spreading outward. The next morning brought chaos. Martha's distress echoed through the mansion as she searched frantically for her beloved necklace. Security was called, rooms were searched, staff were questioned. Andrew watched it all unfold from the shadows, a conductor savoring his symphony. The head of security, following protocol, began with the most recent additions to the staff. Malik sat in a small office, confusion evident on his face as they questioned his movements, his background, his family's financial situation. The search of his belongings was routine, they assured him, until they reached into his backpack. The necklace emerged like a serpent, sapphires catching the light. Malik's face drained of color as he stared at it, uncomprehending. "That's not, I didn't," he stammered, but the evidence was damning. Security guards appeared in the doorway, their faces grim. William arrived moments later, his expression a storm of anger and disappointment. "After everything we've done for you," he said, voice cold. "After the trust we placed in you," each word fell like a hammer, shattering the fragile bridge that had been built between their worlds. Martha turned away, unable to look at Malik. The betrayal felt personal. She had defended him, brought him lemonade, trusted him near her baby. Now she clutched Michael closer, as if protecting him from a newly discovered threat. Andrew stepped forward, playing his role perfectly. "I hate to say I told you so, Father," he said, placing a comforting hand on his mother's shoulder. "But I warned you about bringing in someone from, well, you know." The police arrived within the hour. Detective Miller, the same officer who had interviewed Malik after the rescue, now stood before him with different questions. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone. The hero had become the villain in the span of a single morning. Sarah Thompson arrived at the mansion gates, still in her diner uniform, her face a mask of fear and confusion. She watched helplessly as her son was led to a police car, his hands cuffed behind his back. "There must be some mistake," she kept saying, her voice breaking. "My son wouldn't steal. He knows better. He is better." As the police car pulled away, Andrew stood at his father's study window, allowing himself a small smile. Order would return to their world now. Things would go back to normal. He took a sip of his morning coffee, savoring the taste of victory, unaware that his perfect plan had one fatal flaw, one that would eventually bring everything crashing down around him. Robert watched it all from the garden, his weathered hands gripping his pruning shears too tightly. He had seen the gleam in Andrew's eye, recognized the satisfaction in his stance. 30 years of tending this garden had taught him to spot the difference between natural growth and careful cultivation, including the cultivation of disaster. Silently, he began his own investigation, knowing that truth, like the strongest plants, would eventually find its way to the light. News of Malik's arrest spread through Cedar Street like wildfire. By nightfall, the whispers had become shouts, and by morning, the community that had once celebrated him had turned its back. The local newspaper ran the story on its front page: hero teen revealed as thief betrays family that trusted him. Sarah Thompson faced the changed atmosphere with quiet dignity, though each sideways glance and hushed conversation cut like a knife. At the diner, regular customers who had once praised her son now avoided her section. Her manager, citing customer complaints, cut her hours. The economic impact was immediate and devastating. Emily and Tommy felt the shift at school. Friends whose parents had once welcomed them for play dates were suddenly two busy teachers who had smiled proudly at Malik's siblings now watched them with wary eyes, as if dishonesty might be hereditary. Emily came home crying after overhearing a parent warn their child to stay away from those Thompson kids. The apartment building's residents, once a tight-knit support system, began to distance themselves. Mrs. Rodriguez still brought food, but now she delivered it after dark, as if ashamed to be seen helping the family. Mr. Chen at the corner store stopped extending credit, his face apologetic but firm. "Business is business," he said, avoiding Sarah's eyes. The isolation grew deeper as bills mounted. Without Malik's income, and with Sarah's reduced hours, they fell behind on rent. The landlord, who had once praised Malik as a good kid, now posted eviction warnings with mechanical efficiency. The electric company, despite their previous regular payments, showed no mercy when they missed a due date. Social media amplified the backlash. Local community pages filled with comments debating whether Malik had planned it all from the beginning. Probably staged the rescue to get close to the family, one person suggested. "These people are always looking for angles," another agreed. Each click, each share, each comment drove the knife deeper into the family's wounded reputation. Even the church community, which preached forgiveness from the pulpit, practiced judgment in the pews. The pastor's wife, who had once hugged Malik warmly each Sunday, now clutched her purse tighter when Sarah walked past. The youth group quietly dropped Emily and Tommy from their activities list, citing space limitations. The media vultures returned, but this time their stories had a different flavor. "Fall from grace, local heroes, dark turn," blared one headline. Television crews parked outside their apartment, hoping to catch Sarah for a comment. Their presence made the building's other residents uncomfortable, adding to the pressure on the family to just leave. Tommy started having nightmares, crying out for his brother in the dark. Emily took to wearing hoodies, trying to become invisible at school. Sarah worked double shifts when she could get them, coming home to find disconnection notices and past due bills piling up on their kitchen table. The small potted plant Malik had given them wilted, untended in the chaos. The worst part was the silence. The phone didn't ring anymore. Neighbors didn't stop to chat. The community that had once prided itself on taking care of its own had decided the Thompsons were no longer part of its own. The isolation was a physical presence, as real as the walls of their apartment. Sarah visited Malik in juvenile detention, maintaining her composure until she reached the parking lot, where she would break down in tears. The sight of her son in a jumpsuit, his face drawn and pale, was almost more than she could bear. "I didn't do it, Ma," he would insist, his voice cracking. "I swear on everything. I didn't do it," she believed him, but her belief couldn't pay bills or restore their reputation. The garden at the Hastings estate, once Malik's sanctuary, withered under Andrew's satisfied gaze. Robert worked alone now, his movements slower, his eyes constantly scanning for something only he seemed to be looking for. The roses Malik had tended drooped in the summer heat, as if they too felt the absence of his care. Late at night, Sarah would sit at their kitchen table, surrounded by bills and notices, trying to figure out how to keep their family afloat. The emergency jar, once filled with Malik's careful savings, stood empty on the counter, a reminder of how quickly fortunes could change. She applied for additional jobs, but her applications were mysteriously rejected. The Thompson name had become toxic. The community center, where Malik had once helped younger kids with their homework, removed his photo from their volunteer wall. The local youth baseball team, where he had assisted as a junior coach, scrubbed his name from their website. It was as if they were trying to erase all evidence that they had once celebrated him. Emily stopped drawing, her art supplies gathering dust. Tommy quit asking when his brother would come home. They grew quiet, watchful, learning too young how quickly the world could turn against you. Sarah watched her children's light dim and felt helpless to rekindle it. The final blow came when Sarah found Emily trying to return her books, the ones William Hastings had given them to the mansion's gate. "We're not good enough for them anymore," Emily said, her young voice bitter with understanding beyond her years. Sarah held her daughter as they both cried, the books clutched between them like the last remnants of a dream that had turned into a nightmare. Yet in the darkness of their situation, tiny sparks of loyalty remained. A few neighbors still nodded in greeting, though quickly and furtively. Robert sent anonymous grocery deliveries through a local service. Detective Miller, troubled by inconsistencies in the case, kept the file on his desk instead of filing it away. These small acts of faith were like stars in their darkest hour, distant, but refusing to be extinguished completely. The juvenile detention center's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Malik's face as he sat alone in his cell. The once proud boy who had rushed into a burning car to save a baby now barely recognized himself in the scratched metal mirror. Dark circles ringed his eyes and his shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. Each day blurred into the next, marked only by the routine of meals, recreation time, and mandatory counseling sessions. The counselor, M.S. Peters, watched him with a mix of confusion and concern. "Your file doesn't match the boy I see before me," she'd say, studying his downcast eyes. Something doesn't add up. Nights were the worst. In the darkness, Malik replayed every moment at the Hastings estate, searching for clues he might have missed. He thought about the garden, about Robert's patient teachings, about the trust he'd earned and lost. The necklace's appearance in his backpack felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. Depression settled over him like a heavy blanket. He stopped eating regularly, pushing the bland detention center food around his plate. His dreams were filled with images of his siblings' faces, their disappointment and confusion when they visited. Emily wouldn't meet his eyes anymore, and Tommy clung to Sarah, no longer running to hug his big brother. Other detainees learned his story and mocked him mercilessly. "Hey, hero," they'd sneer in the recreation yard. "Save any rich babies lately." The taunts didn't hurt as much as the memory of William Hastings' face when the necklace was discovered. That look of betrayal and disgust had burned itself into Malik's mind. During family visits, he tried to stay strong for his mother, but her exhausted face told him everything. She worked longer hours now, trying to make up for his lost income. The strain showed in her trembling hands and the new grey strands in her hair. "We'll figure this out," she promised, but her voice lacked conviction. His school sent his assignments to the detention center, but the words swam before his eyes. The dreams of college and a better future that had begun to form during his time at the Hastings estate now seemed like cruel jokes. Who would accept him with a theft charge on his record? What doors weren't already slamming shut? Self-doubt ate at him like acid. Had he been foolish to think he could bridge the gap between his world and the Hastings? Was Andrew right? Did he not belong in their world? The questions circled in his mind during sleepless nights, each one cutting deeper than the last. The small container garden he'd started on their fire escape withered without his care. Emily wrote in one of her letters that she'd tried to water the plants, but they died anyway. It felt symbolic somehow, the death of something hopeful he'd tried to grow. Worst were the moments when he doubted himself. Late at night, alone in his cell, he'd wonder if he had done it, if the stress of trying to help his family had pushed him to desperation without him even realizing it. These thoughts terrified him more than anything else. His hands, once calloused from garden work, grew soft. The muscles he'd developed from physical labor began to waste away in the confined space. Even his posture changed, curling inward as if trying to make himself smaller, less visible to the world's judgment. Letters from home became his lifeline, though they brought their own kind of pain. Emily wrote about skipping lunch because kids stole her food. Tommy described nightmares where he couldn't find his big brother. Sarah's notes were determinedly cheerful, but water stains suggested tears had fallen as she wrote. Peters noticed his spiral and arranged extra counseling sessions. Depression doesn't mean guilt, she told him. Sometimes the most honest people suffer the most. When falsely accused, her words were kind, but they couldn't penetrate the wall of shame and despair he'd built around himself. One morning, he found himself staring at his reflection, trying to recognize the person he'd been before, the boy who'd run toward danger to save a child, who'd worked hard to help his family, who'd dared to dream of a better future. That person seemed to have vanished, replaced by a shadow. The few books allowed in his cell went unread, except for a gardening manual Robert had somehow managed to send him. He'd flipped through its pages at night, running his fingers over the pictures of flowers he'd once tended, remembering the peace he'd found in the Hastings garden. His cellmate, a boy named Jake in for vandalism, watched Malik's descent with growing concern. "You're different from most guys in here," Jake said one night. "You've got something they can't take away. Whatever it is, don't lose it." But Malik wasn't sure what that something was anymore. The darkness inside him grew until it felt physical, a weight in his chest that made it hard to breathe. He stopped defending himself during questioning, stopped insisting on his innocence. What was the point? The world had already decided who he was. Yet somewhere, buried deep beneath the layers of despair, a tiny spark refused to die. It flared whenever he thought of his siblings, whenever he remembered Robert's quiet strength, whenever he recalled the moment he'd pulled Michael from the crashed car. That spark waited, patient and persistent, for someone to notice what he himself had started to forget, the truth that would eventually set him free. But for now, in the harsh fluorescent light of his cell, Malik Thompson was a boy drowning in darkness, his once bright future dimming with each passing day, unaware that forces were already in motion that would bring the truth to light. Robert Anderson had spent 30 years tending the Hastings garden, learning that the most important growth happened beneath the surface. Now, in the quiet hours before dawn, he began cultivating a different kind of truth. Armed with only his weathered hands and sharp observation skills, he started his own investigation into Malik's case. The security cameras were his first focus. Years of early morning work had taught him their blind spots, their patterns of movement. He noticed something odd in the footage from the day of the theft, a 3-minute gap during shift change, something that had never happened before. More interesting was how quickly Andrew had suggested reviewing that specific time frame. Late at night, after the household had settled, Robert would slip through the gardens he knew so intimately. He discovered cigarette butts near the garden shed, Marlboro Reds, Andrew's brand, on the morning of the theft, though the young master claimed he'd been out with friends all evening. Small details, perhaps, but Robert had learned that gardens revealed their secrets through such subtle signs. He befriended Jenny, one of the newer maids who cleaned Andrew's wing of the mansion. Over shared coffee breaks, she mentioned strange behavior, Andrew making late-night phone calls about security schedules, unusual interest in his mother's jewelry inventory, suspicious meetings with the head of security. "He's been different since that boy started working here," she confided, her voice low. The head of security, Frank Wilson, had been unusually quick to search Malik's belongings. Robert noticed how he'd bypassed standard protocol, going straight to the boy's backpack. Through careful conversations with other staff members, Robert learned that Frank's son had recently started at an expensive private school, a tuition impossible on a security guard's salary. Detective Miller became an unexpected ally. The officer had been troubled by inconsistencies in the case and found himself sharing coffee with Robert in the garden shed, discussing peculiarities that bothered them both. The boy's fingerprints weren't on the necklace, Miller revealed, and the security footage gaps are too convenient. Robert started keeping a journal, documenting every detail, every conversation, every strange occurrence. He noted how Andrew's behavior changed after Malik's arrest: the smugness, the increased drinking, the casual cruelty to staff. The young man seemed to revel in his family's renewed attention, particularly his father's dependence on him for estate matters. Martha's personal assistant, Elizabeth, proved another valuable source. She remembered Andrew asking detailed questions about the necklace weeks before it disappeared, its value, its insurance, its emotional significance to his mother. He seemed fixated, Elizabeth told Robert during their weekly garden walk, almost obsessed with its importance to the family. The gardener methodically built a network of allies among the staff. The cook mentioned Andrew's late-night kitchen visits, reeking of expensive whiskey and muttering about putting people in their place. The chauffeur recalled driving Andrew to pawn shops in the weeks before the theft, though the young man had plenty of money. William's secretary, Margaret, shared in crucial detail Andrew's trust fund had new conditions. His father, frustrated with his son's behavior, had added requirements about employment and responsibility. The timing coincided perfectly with Andrew's sudden interest in learning the family business. Robert took to visiting Malik in detention, ostensibly to bring gardening books. These visits served two purposes: keeping the boy's spirit alive and gathering more information about the day of the theft. Malik's consistent story, down to the smallest detail, strengthened Robert's conviction about his innocence. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. While pruning roses near Andrew's window, Robert overheard a heated phone conversation. Andrew was arguing with someone about getting rid of evidence and keeping your mouth shut. The gardener's weathered hands trembled as he carefully noted the date and time. Detective Miller brought more pieces to the puzzle. The pawn shops in Andrew's GPS history matched locations where other stolen items had been fenced. The detective couldn't prove anything yet, but the pattern was becoming clear. "Keep digging," he told Robert. "Something's going to break." Frank Wilson's sudden purchase of a new car raised more red flags. Robert noticed the security chief's nervous behavior whenever Andrew was around, the way he jumped to do the young man's bidding. It suggested complicity, perhaps blackmail. The gardener's investigation affected his work for the first time in 30 years. Plants went untended as he focused on gathering evidence. Though he made sure the roses near Andrew's window received extra attention, they provided the perfect cover for his surveillance. Martha noticed the change in her beloved garden but attributed it to Malik's absence. She'd stop by the shed sometimes, reminiscing about the boy's careful work with the flowers. Robert would listen, noting how her doubts about Malik's guilt seemed to grow stronger with each conversation. William remained distant, buried in work, but Robert saw how the situation weighed on him. The businessman's confidence had been shaken, not just in Malik, but in his own judgment. The gardener recognized the heavy steps of a man questioning everything he thought he knew. Throughout his investigation, Robert maintained his quiet, unassuming demeanor. He was just the gardener, after all invisible to those who saw only status and power. This invisibility became his greatest asset, allowing him to move freely, observe carefully, and collect the pieces of truth others had overlooked. As summer turned to fall, Robert's evidence pile grew along with his certainty. The truth was there, hidden like roots beneath the soil, waiting for the right moment to break through. He knew he had to be patient, had to let his case grow strong enough to withstand the storm that would come when he finally revealed what he knew. Each night, after finishing his secret work, Robert would stand in the garden Malik had helped tend. The flowers still bloomed, testament to the care they'd received. Truth is like these plants, he would think. It needs time, patience, and the right conditions to grow. He could only hope he was providing all three. The past has a way of resurfacing, like stubborn weeds breaking through carefully maintained gardens. As Robert's investigation deepened, an unexpected discovery shook the foundation of the Hastings family saga. In a dusty hospital record, Detective Miller found a connection that changed everything. Sarah Thompson had once been a nurse at City Memorial, specifically in the private wing, where Martha Hastings had spent 3 months fighting for her life during a complicated pregnancy. Martha's near-fatal complications during her pregnancy with Andrew had been kept quiet, a closely guarded family secret. But the records showed something remarkable. Sarah Thompson, then a young nurse, had worked double shifts to monitor Martha personally, refusing to leave her side during the critical hours. Her quick thinking and dedication had saved both mother and child when complications arose. William Hastings had tried to reward her with a substantial check, but Sarah had declined, saying simply, "It's my job to help people." The same quiet dignity, the same unwavering integrity that she had passed on to her son. Martha, still weak from her ordeal, had never learned the name of the nurse who saved her, and Sarah had never sought recognition. Robert shared this discovery with Elizabeth, Martha's assistant, who remembered finding an old thank you note in Martha's journals, never sent because they couldn't locate the nurse who had disappeared after declining the reward. The note spoke of gratitude that went beyond money, of a debt that could never be repaid. As these connections emerged, another truth surfaced about the day of Michael's accident. Security footage from neighboring buildings, carefully collected by Detective Miller, revealed something chilling. Andrew's car had been at the intersection minutes before the crash. Witnesses began to remember a black BMW speeding away from the scene, though no one had thought to mention it before. The nurse who had been driving Michael that day finally awoke from her coma. Her first coherent words to Detective Miller were about a black car that had forced her off the road. She remembered the driver young, well-dressed, angry-looking. When shown a photo lineup, her hand trembled as she pointed to Andrew's picture. Martha found herself revisiting memories of Andrew's behavior around Michael. The cold stares, the subtle threats disguised as jokes, the way he would hold the baby just a little too carelessly when others were watching. She began to understand the darkness that had been growing in her eldest son, fed by jealousy and entitlement. William discovered discrepancies in the company accounts that led back to Andrew. Small at first, but growing bolder money siphoned to offshore accounts, suspicious contracts with shell companies, all bearing his son's digital fingerprints. The pattern suggested not just theft, but a calculated plan to secure his inheritance by any means necessary. Robert's gardening journal revealed another layer of truth. He had documented Andrew's late-night activities in the weeks leading up to Malik's arrest, suspicious meetings, buried objects near the rose bushes, hushed phone conversations about taking care of the problem. The gardener's detailed notes painted a picture of premeditation that could no longer be ignored. Sarah's own memories began to surface as she heard about Martha's history. She remembered the frightened young mother she had cared for, the way Martha had clung to her hand during the darkest hours. She had never mentioned it to anyone, not even Malik, believing that some acts of kindness should remain private. The hospital records also revealed something else. Andrew's birth had left Martha unable to have more children. Michael's arrival years later, through what Martha had called a miracle, had shattered Andrew's certainty about his position as sole heir. The timing of his escalating behavior aligned perfectly with his brother's birth. Frank Wilson, the head of security, finally broke under the weight of his conscience. He confessed to Detective Miller about Andrew's blackmail, the threats against his family, the carefully orchestrated theft of the necklace. His testimony provided the missing pieces that connected all the evidence Robert had gathered. Elizabeth found old photographs in Martha's study, including one of Sarah in her nurse's uniform, standing beside Martha's hospital bed. The image was unmistakable, the same kind eyes, the same gentle determination that Malik had inherited. Martha broke down when she saw it, understanding finally the full circle of debt and gratitude that connected their families. Among the evidence Robert collected was a recording from his phone, accidentally activated during garden work. It had captured Andrew's voice, clear and arrogant, boasting to someone about how easily he had framed that charity case and secured his position in the family. The recording also revealed his role in Michael's accident, not an attempt to harm, he claimed, but to scare the nurse into quitting. The web of connections grew clearer. Sarah had saved Andrew's life at birth, only to have him attempt to destroy her son's life years later. Malik had saved Michael, unwittingly protecting him from his own brother's jealous machinations. The same family that had once owed Sarah everything had nearly destroyed her son. William found himself revisiting every interaction with Andrew, seeing the manipulation that had been there all along. The subtle undermining of Malik, the calculated shows of reform and responsibility, the careful orchestration of doubt and suspicion, all designed to protect his position as heir apparent. The truth emerged like a complex tapestry, each thread connecting to reveal a larger pattern of jealousy, privilege, and destructive entitlement. The same social divisions that had made Malik's presence at the estate so remarkable had also fueled Andrew's certainty that he could destroy the boy with impunity. Robert's patient investigation had not just uncovered a false accusation, it had revealed the deep connections between two families, the long arc of karma that had brought them together twice through acts of selfless courage, and the poison of privilege that had nearly destroyed it all. As the final pieces fell into place, the truth stood revealed in all its complexity, a story of two mothers, two sons, two acts of sacrifice separated by 15 years, and the different paths their lives had taken. One family had nurtured values of service and integrity, while the other had inadvertently fostered entitlement and cruelty in their eldest son's heart. Detective Miller gathered all the evidence into a comprehensive report, knowing that its revelation would shake both families to their foundations. The truth would bring justice for Malik, but it would also force the Hastings family to confront the darkness they had allowed to grow in their midst. As Robert's investigation gathered momentum, a quiet network of support began to form around the Thompson family. It started small, like the first tender shoots breaking through soil after winter. Mrs. Rodriguez resumed her evening visits openly now, bringing not just food but information gathered from her cousin, who worked as a janitor at the juvenile detention center. Detective Miller made increasingly frequent stops at the diner where Sarah worked, leaving generous tips and sharing careful hints about the investigation's progress. His presence deterred the worst of the whispered comments, and slowly regular customers began returning to Sarah's section, their earlier judgments softening into something like shame. Emily and Tommy's teachers noticed the change first. Emerson, Emily's art teacher, found extra supplies in the classroom, insisting the young girl take them home. Mr. Parker, who taught Tommy's class, started a free tutoring program that coincidentally fit perfectly with Sarah's work schedule. Robert became the unlikely center of this growing support system. His position at the Hastings estate made him a bridge between two worlds, and he used this advantage carefully. He arranged for garden surplus, fresh vegetables and fruits to find its way to the Thompsons' door through a network of neighborhood kids who had once helped Malik with odd jobs. The local church community, led by Deacon Lewis, began to question their hasty judgment. Sunday services started featuring homilies about false accusations and the importance of mercy. The youth group leader personally visited Sarah, asking Emily and Tommy to rejoin their activities. "We were wrong to exclude them," she admitted publicly. At the juvenile detention center, Malik found unexpected allies. Jake, his former cellmate, had been released but continued to visit, bringing messages from the neighborhood and updates about his family. Other inmates, seeing his quiet dignity in the face of accusation, began standing up for him against the routine harassment. Mr. Chen reopened his informal credit line at the corner store, adding extra items to Sarah's bags. With a quiet "Malik always helped carry my deliveries." No charge for family, his actions inspired other local business owners to quietly extend similar kindnesses to the Thompsons. The apartment building's residents organized a subtle rotation of support. Someone would casually bring up extra dinner, another would offer to watch the kids while Sarah worked extra shifts, and mysterious envelopes containing small amounts of cash would appear under their door, anonymous but desperately needed. Robert's garden became a gathering place for these quiet conspirators. The elderly gardener would listen to their reports while tending his beloved roses, coordinating efforts to support the family while gathering evidence to clear Malik's name. Martha's prized flower beds had never been better tended, as Robert used his gardening duties as cover for these clandestine meetings. Detective Miller developed a habit of parking his patrol car near the Thompsons' apartment during his coffee breaks. His presence discouraged the more aggressive reporters who still occasionally tried to harass the family. Other officers on his beat began following his example, creating an unofficial protective circle around the building. Sarah's co-workers at the diner started a subtle campaign of their own. They pooled tips, covered her shifts when she needed to visit Malik, and deliberately seated sympathetic customers in her section. The diner's owner, witnessing this solidarity, quietly restored her full schedule. Emily's art became a symbol of resistance. Her teacher organized a school art show featuring her work drawings of her family, including Malik, always shown in bright colors and happy scenes. The exhibition drew unexpected attention, and several pieces sold to anonymous buyers who insisted on paying well above the suggested prices. Tommy's baseball coach reinstated him on the team, personally driving him to practices and games. "Your brother helped build this team," he told Tommy. "We don't abandon family." Other parents, following his lead, began including Tommy in their carpools and post-game celebrations. The local community center, where Malik had volunteered, kept his photo on their wall despite pressure to remove it. The director started a Justice for Malik petition, gathering signatures from people whose lives the young man had touched through his volunteer work. Even some of the Hastings household staff began to quietly question the official story. Maids would deliberately linger while cleaning near Andrew's rooms, noting suspicious behavior and reporting back to Robert. The kitchen staff kept track of Andrew's late-night movements, documenting his drinking patterns and angry outbursts. A former security guard, who had quit shortly after Malik's arrest, contacted Detective Miller with information about unusual changes to the security protocols on the day of the theft. His testimony added another piece to the growing puzzle of evidence. Martha's personal assistant, Elizabeth, began keeping a detailed diary of Andrew's behavior and conversations, her loyalty to the family now extending to uncovering the truth, no matter how painful. She shared her observations with Robert, adding crucial details to his investigation. Local college students who had learned about the case started a social media campaign questioning the evidence and highlighting Malik's character. They gathered testimonials from people who knew him, creating a counter-narrative to the initial media coverage. The support network grew stronger as more people began to question the official version of events. Small acts of kindness multiplied, creating a safety net for the Thompson family. While Sarah and her children still faced daily challenges, they were no longer facing them alone. Robert watched this community response with quiet satisfaction, knowing that each person who chose to help was also choosing to believe in Malik's innocence. The growing support network became another form of evidence testament to the impact one young man had made on his community before his fall from grace. As autumn approached, the underground movement to support the Thompsons had become a quiet force in the neighborhood. Like the gardens Robert tended, it grew stronger each day, nurtured by belief in justice and the power of community. The truth would soon emerge, but until then, this network of support sustained a family in crisis, proving that even in the darkest times, hope could grow from the smallest seeds of faith. The confrontation erupted on a stormy October evening at Hastings Manor. William had called an emergency family meeting, the evidence folder from Detective Miller heavy in his hands. Thunder rolled outside as the family gathered in his study, Martha cradling Michael, Andrew sprawled in a leather chair with his usual air of casual disdain, and Robert standing quietly by the door at William's unusual request. "I've discovered some disturbing information," William began, his voice tight with controlled anger. He removed photographs from the folder security camera, still showing Andrew's BMW near the accident scene, bank statements revealing suspicious transfers, and transcripts of damning phone conversations. Andrew's face remained impassive, but his knuckles whitened on the chair's armrest. "What's this about, Father?" "More concerns about your precious charity case," his attempted sneer faltered as William slammed a hand on his desk, making Martha jump. "This is about attempted murder, Andrew." Your own brother William's voice shook with fury. "We have footage of you forcing the nurse's car off the road. We have witnesses. What were you thinking?" Color drained from Martha's face as she clutched Michael closer. "Andrew," she whispered, "tell me this isn't true. Tell me you didn't try to hurt your brother." The baby, sensing the tension, began to whimper. Andrew stood abruptly, his carefully maintained facade cracking. "That little brat ruined everything," he shouted, pointing at Michael. "I was supposed to be the heir, me. Then you had your miracle baby, and suddenly I wasn't good enough anymore." Security guards appeared at the doorway, summoned by Robert's discreet signal. Andrew's eyes darted between them, his composure dissolving completely. "And that street rat you all fell in love with? Playing perfect son while you looked at me like I was nothing." "Malik saved your brother's life," Martha said quietly, her voice gaining strength. "The life you tried to take. My God, Andrew, what have you become?" William held up the necklace, Martha's sapphire piece that had condemned Malik. "Tell us about this," he demanded. "Tell us how you planted it in his backpack. Tell us about bribing Frank Wilson to alter security footage." Andrew's laugh was harsh, hysteric. "You want to know? Fine. It was easy. So easy. Everyone was ready to believe the worst about him. The poor kid from the wrong side of town, trying to rise above his station. Please. I barely had to do anything." Thunder crashed outside as Andrew paced the study like a caged animal. "You were all so perfect, weren't you?" said Martha with her miracle baby. "Father with his new protege. Even the servants preferred him. Do you know what that's like? Watching everyone fall in love with some charity case while your own family turns against you." "We never turned against you," Martha protested, tears streaming down her face. "We loved you. We still love you." "Love," Andrew spat the word. "You call this love? Ambushing me with accusations? Believing some gardener's investigation over your own son?" He gestured contemptuously at Robert, who remained silently watchful. William stood, his authority filling the room. "The police are on their way, Andrew. Detective Miller has enough evidence to charge you with multiple crimes. But before they arrive, I wanted to give you a chance to show some remorse, to prove there's still something of the son we raised in you." Andrew's face contorted with rage. He lunged for the desk, scattering papers, reaching for Michael's baby photos with destructive intent. The security guards moved swiftly, restraining him as he thrashed and screamed accusations. "You never deserved any of this," he shouted at his parents. "And neither does that street trash you replaced me with. I should have let the brat burn in that car. I should have." He stopped abruptly, realizing what he'd revealed. Martha gasped, and William's face hardened into stone. Even the security guard's grips tightened at this admission of premeditated malice. Detective Miller chose that moment to enter, flanked by uniformed officers. "I think we've heard enough," he said quietly, nodding to his team. "Andrew Hastings, you're under arrest." As the police led Andrew away, his expensive clothes disheveled, his mask of superiority shattered, he turned one last time to his family. "You'll regret this," he snarled, "all of you." William held Martha as she sobbed. Michael clutched between them. The study fell silent except for the storm outside and the fading sound of police sirens. Robert moved quietly through the room, gathering the scattered evidence, his patient cultivation of truth finally bearing fruit. "Call Sarah Thompson," William said finally, his voice hoarse. "Tell her to bring Malik home. Tell her," he paused, looking around the destroyed study, the wreckage of his family's illusions. "Tell her we're sorry. We're so sorry." The town hall meeting was hastily arranged but fully packed. William Hastings had insisted on making the truth public in the same community that had witnessed Malik's downfall. The prominent citizens who had once shunned the Thompsons now shifted uncomfortably in their seats as Detective Miller set up the evidence presentation. Sarah Thompson sat in the front row, flanked by Emily and Tommy, their small hands clutched tightly in hers. Malik, newly released but still bearing the physical and emotional marks of his detention, sat beside them, his back straight despite his obvious exhaustion. The room hushed as William Hastings approached the podium. 3 months ago, William began, his voice carrying through the silent room, "I made a terrible mistake. I allowed prejudice and assumptions to blind me to the truth. I wrongly accused an innocent young man, a hero who had saved my son's life, of a crime he didn't commit." The projector flickered to life, showing security footage of Andrew's BMW near the crash site. Detective Miller stepped forward, methodically presenting the evidence: phone records, bank statements, witness testimonies. The audience gasped as the full scope of Andrew's schemes became clear. "My eldest son William," continued, his voice breaking slightly, "orchestrated not only the theft and false accusation but was also responsible for the accident that nearly killed his baby brother. An accident from which Malik Thompson, without hesitation or thought of reward, saved Michael's life." Martha Hastings stood then, Michael in her arms, and approached the podium. "There's more," she said softly. 15 years ago, when I nearly died giving birth to Andrew, a young nurse stayed by my side through the worst night of my life. She refused any payment, saying it was simply her duty." She turned to Sarah, tears in her eyes. That nurse was Sarah Thompson. A murmur ran through the crowd as old hospital photographs appeared on the screen, showing a younger Sarah in her nurse's uniform, standing beside Martha's hospital bed. The connection between the families, spanning years and social divisions, stunned the audience into silence. Robert stepped forward next, his weathered hands holding his gardening journal. He detailed his careful investigation, the clues he had gathered, the pattern of Andrew's behavior. His quiet dignity lent weight to every word as he described how prejudice and privilege had nearly destroyed an innocent family. The evidence was irrefutable. Security camera footage showed Andrew planting the necklace. Frank Wilson's confession revealed the carefully orchestrated theft. Phone records documented the conspiracy. But most damning was the recorded conversation where Andrew boasted about framing the charity case and arranging his brother's accident. As the truth unfolded, the community leaders who had been quickest to condemn Malik seemed to physically shrink in their seats. The pastor who had excluded the Thompsons from church activities stared at the floor. The school board member who had suggested Emily and Tommy transfer to a different district dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Detective Miller presented the final piece of evidence, Andrew's own confession from the study confrontation, his mask of privilege finally cracking to reveal the malice beneath. The recording of his words, full of hate and entitlement, echoed through the stunned room. William returned to the podium, his shoulders heavy with responsibility. "I stand here today not just to clear Malik's name, but to apologize to the entire Thompson family. My prejudices, my assumptions, my failure to see the truth, these caused immeasurable harm to people who deserved only our gratitude and respect." Martha stepped forward again, this time addressing Sarah directly. "You saved both my sons, first Andrew through your care as a nurse, then Michael through raising a son brave enough to run into danger to save a stranger's child. We can never repay that debt." Malik sat quietly through it all, his face a study in dignity despite the tears that occasionally slipped down his cheeks. Emily and Tommy held his hands tighter with each new revelation, while Sarah's quiet strength seemed to support them all. The community members who had formed the silent support network during the family's darkest days now stood one by one, adding their voices to the truth. Mrs. Rodriguez spoke of Sarah's unwavering faith in her son. Mr. Chen described Malik's daily kindnesses. Robert's fellow gardeners testified to the young man's character and work ethic. As the last piece of evidence was presented, a profound silence fell over the room. The truth laid bare was more than just a wrongful accusation exposed, it was a mirror held up to the community's prejudices, assumptions, and failures. The ease with which they had believed the worst of Malik revealed uncomfortable truths about their own biases. William concluded the presentation by announcing the establishment of a scholarship fund in Malik's name, dedicated to supporting young people who, like him, demonstrated extraordinary character in the face of adversity. But as the applause echoed through the hall, everyone knew that no amount of money could fully right the wrongs that had been done. The truth had finally emerged, like a flower breaking through concrete, nurtured by Robert's patient investigation and watered by the tears of both families. But its beauty was tinged with the thorns of revelation, the knowledge of how easily justice could be perverted by prejudice, and how quickly a community could turn against its own. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Eleanor Patterson prepared to deliver her verdict. Andrew Hastings, his expensive suit unable to mask his disheveled appearance after weeks in custody, stood at the defendant's table. The evidence against him had been overwhelming: attempted murder, fraud, false accusation, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Andrew Hastings. Judge Patterson began, her voice clear and firm. "This court has rarely seen such a calculated series of crimes motivated by nothing more than privilege and jealousy. You attempted to kill your infant brother, endangered an innocent nurse, and then tried to destroy the life of the very person who saved your victim." William and Martha sat in the front row, Michael sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms. Behind them, the Thompson family watched quietly. Malik, now free but forever changed by his experience, sat between his mother and siblings, their presence a shield of love and support. "The prosecution has proven beyond any doubt that you orchestrated not only the accident that endangered your brother's life, but also the elaborate frame-up of Malik Thompson. Your actions show a disturbing pattern of premeditation and malice that this court cannot ignore." The judge paused, surveying the courtroom. Robert sat near the back, his weathered hands folded in his lap, watching justice finally bloom from the seeds of truth he had carefully tended. Detective Miller stood by the prosecution table, his case files documenting every step of Andrew's downfall. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "your attempt to exploit social prejudices and class divisions to conceal your crimes demonstrates a level of manipulation that demands severe consequences. You counted on society's willingness to believe the worst about a young man solely because of his economic status. Frank Wilson, the former head of security who had turned state's evidence, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His testimony about Andrew's bribes and threats had helped seal the case, but his own role in the conspiracy had earned him a separate sentence to be served. In addition to the criminal charges, this court must address the civil damages you have caused. The Thompson family suffered severe financial hardship, social ostracism, and emotional trauma due to your actions. Malik Thompson spent 3 months in juvenile detention for a crime you committed. Sarah reached for Malik's hand as the judge spoke, remembering the long nights of worry, the struggle to keep their family afloat while fighting for her son's freedom. Emily and Tommy pressed closer to their brother, their young faces solemn with understanding beyond their years. Therefore, it is the judgment of this court that you, Andrew Hastings, will serve 15 years in state prison for the attempted murder charge, with additional consecutive sentences for your other crimes, totaling 25 years. You will pay substantial restitution to the Thompson family. And your trust fund will be used to establish a victims' compensation fund. A murmur ran through the courtroom as the severity of the sentence registered. Andrew's face, which had maintained its arrogant expression throughout the trial, finally cracked. The reality of his actions and their consequences seemed to hit him all at once. Additionally, the judge added, "This court recommends mandatory psychological counseling during your incarceration. Your actions suggest deep-seated issues that must be addressed before you can safely return to society." Martha quietly wiped away tears, mourning not just her eldest son's crimes, but the loss of the child she thought she had raised. William sat rigid, his face a mask of contained grief and responsibility. They had contributed to this outcome through their blind spots and privileges, and they knew it. Malik Thompson, Judge Patterson's voice softened slightly as she addressed him directly. "This court offers its deepest apologies for the miscarriage of justice you suffered. Your record will be fully expunged, and a formal letter of exoneration will be entered into the public record." Malik nodded solemnly, his quiet dignity in the face of vindication moving many in the courtroom to tears. He had emerged from his ordeal not bitter, but stronger, wiser, and even more determined to help others. Let the record show. The judge concluded that justice in this case was only possible through the dedication of those who refused to accept convenient lies, particularly Mr. Robert Anderson, whose patient investigation revealed the truth, and Detective James Miller, who followed the evidence rather than assumptions. As Andrew was led away in handcuffs, his final glance at his family held not anger but something closer to fear of the long years ahead, fear of the truth he would have to face about himself. The courtroom began to empty, but the two families remained, bound together by tragedy and redemption. William approached Malik, extending his hand. "We can never fully make this right," he said quietly, "but we will spend the rest of our lives trying." Malik took his hand, his forgiveness offered freely, understanding that true justice included the possibility of healing. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered to document the end of a case that had exposed the fault lines of privilege and prejudice in their community. But the real story was inside, where two families, divided by circumstance but united by acts of courage and sacrifice, began the long process of healing together. Justice had been served, not just through the court's verdict, but through the restoration of truth, the acknowledgement of wrongs, and the promise of change. As Malik walked out into the sunlight, surrounded by his family and supported by those who had believed in him, he carried with him the knowledge that sometimes the greatest victory is not in revenge, but in remaining true to oneself through the darkest of times. The victory in court should have marked the end of their struggles, but life had other plans. Just 3 days after Andrew's sentencing, Sarah Thompson collapsed during her shift at the diner. The years of double shifts, constant stress, and the recent months of fighting for her son's freedom had taken their toll. The emergency room at City Memorial was chaos when Malik arrived, Emily and Tommy clutching his hands as they ran through the fluorescent-lit corridors. A doctor met them with a grave expression that made Malik's heart stop. "Your mother has suffered a severe cardiac event," she explained. "The next 24 hours will be critical." Through the observation window, Sarah looked small and fragile, surrounded by beeping machines and snaking tubes. This woman who had carried their family through impossible times, who had never shown weakness, now fought for her life. The sight of her usually strong hands lying limp on stark white sheets shattered something in Malik's chest. The medical bills arrived before Sarah even regained consciousness, their numbers staggering. The insurance from the diner covered barely a fraction of the costs. The compensation from the Hastings case was still tied up in legal proceedings, weeks or months away from being released. The emergency fund they'd slowly rebuilt was nowhere near enough. Emily tried to be strong, taking over the cooking and cleaning at home, but Malik would find her crying in the bathroom late at night, clutching their mother's worn bathrobe. Tommy stopped speaking almost entirely, carrying his toy cars to the hospital each day, lining them up on the windowsill of Sarah's room as if they could guide her back to them. The doctors spoke in careful terms about extensive damage and necessary procedures, each word carrying the weight of another bill they couldn't afford. Malik spent his nights in the uncomfortable hospital chair, holding his mother's hand, trying to give back some of the strength she had always provided them. Mrs. Rodriguez organized a rotation of neighbors to watch the kids when Malik needed to be at the hospital. Mr. Chen sent food daily, refusing payment. The diner staff pooled their tips to help with expenses. But the mountain of medical bills grew faster than their community's generous efforts could match. One evening, as Malik sat by his mother's bed reviewing bills with trembling hands, he heard her monitors speed up. Her eyes fluttered open, focusing slowly on his face. Her first whispered words were, "Are the kids okay?" Even now, barely conscious, her only thought was for her children. The doctors rushed in, checking vitals and adjusting medications. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, each awakening bringing both hope and fear. The specialists talked about the need for surgery, expensive procedures that could help her recover but carried their own risks, both medical and financial. Malik found himself in the hospital chapel late one night, not praying exactly, but asking the universe how much more his family could endure. They had weathered false accusations, imprisonment, and social ostracism. Would they now lose the person who had held them together through it all? The younger kids started showing signs of strain. Emily's teacher called about declining grades and withdrawn behavior. Tommy's nightmares returned, worse than before. Malik felt stretched impossibly thin between the hospital, home, and trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for his siblings. Robert visited the hospital when he could, bringing flowers from the Hastings garden and quiet support. His weathered face showed his own worry. He had seen too many families broken by medical crises, too many children forced to grow up too fast. "Stay strong, son," he would say, his calloused hand squeezing Malik's shoulder. "Your mother's a fighter." The doctors began talking about long-term care facilities, rehabilitation centers, ongoing treatments, each option presenting a new financial hurdle. Malik started looking into loans, second jobs, anything to keep their family afloat. But the irony of their situation wasn't lost on him. They had won justice in court, but might still lose everything to medical bills. Sarah's condition remained precarious, her recovery uncertain. As Malik watched the sun rise through the hospital window, holding his mother's fragile hand, he wondered if their family would survive this latest test. They had overcome so much already, but this challenge felt different, a race against time, against finances, against the limits of the human body's ability to heal. News of Sarah's condition reached Andrew Hastings in prison through his mother's carefully worded letter. The stark concrete walls of his cell offered no escape from the weight of realization that crashed over him. The woman fighting for her life was the same nurse who had saved his own mother, and by extension him. Initially, he crumpled the letter, throwing it across his cell in familiar anger, But in the quiet hours of the night, surrounded by the consequences of his actions, something began to shift in his hardened heart. The woman who had saved his life 15 years ago might now lose hers, partly due to the stress he had caused her family. After 3 days of internal struggle, Andrew requested a meeting with his father. William arrived at the prison visiting room, surprise evident on his tired face. It was their first meeting since the sentencing. "I want to help," Andrew said without preamble, his voice rough with disuse. "Use my trust fund for her medical bills." William studied his son carefully, looking for signs of manipulation or ulterior motives. But Andrew's usual mask of arrogance had cracked, revealing something raw and genuine underneath. "I've spent my whole life taking," Andrew continued, his hands trembling on the visiting room table. "Let me give something back, even if it's too late." The legal proceedings were complex. A convicted felon voluntarily surrendering his trust fund required multiple court approvals. Andrew's lawyers argued against it, suggesting it was a sign of mental instability. But he remained firm, insisting that every penny go to Sarah's care. "I owe her my life," twice over he wrote in his formal request to the judge, once through her care as a nurse, and once through her son's courage in saving Michael. Martha visited him after the papers were signed, bringing photos of Michael. Instead of his usual bitter remarks about his brother, Andrew asked quiet questions about the baby's health and development. "Does he still like those stuffed elephants?" he asked, remembering details that surprised even himself. The ones Malik used to arrange in his crib. The prison psychiatrist noted a significant change in Andrew's behavior. He began participating in group therapy, talking about privilege, accountability, and the long path to redemption. His fellow inmates, initially wary of the wealthy man who had framed an innocent kid, started to see glimpses of humanity beneath his facade. When word reached him that the funds had been successfully transferred and Sarah's medical care was fully covered, Andrew wept for the first time since childhood. Not for himself, not for his lost freedom or fortune, but for the years of pain he had caused others through his selfishness and spite. He wrote letters to Malik, to his parents, to Michael, knowing they might never be read but needing to put his remorse into words. The prison chaplain found him late one night, trying to figure out how to apologize for actions that seemed unforgivable. "Redemption isn't earned in grand gestures," the chaplain advised. "It's built day by day, choice by choice." The trust fund that had once represented his entitlement now served a greater purpose. Every expensive procedure, every specialized treatment, every step of Sarah's recovery would be fully funded. The money he had once used to destroy would now be used to heal. In his cell, Andrew kept the newspaper clipping about Sarah's improving condition. It was a small step on an impossibly long road to redemption, but for the first time in his life, he was walking that road not out of obligation or manipulation, but out of a genuine desire to right his wrongs. The prison guards noticed the change in him too. The demanding, privileged inmate who had arrived full of rage was slowly being replaced by someone quieter, more thoughtful. He started helping in the prison library, teaching reading to fellow inmates who had never had the educational opportunities he had taken for granted. While his actions couldn't undo the past, they represented something significant, the first real understanding of the responsibility that came with privilege and the beginning of a journey toward becoming someone different from the person who had caused so much pain. The news of Andrew's redemptive gesture spread through Cedar Street like a healing balm. The same community that had once shunned the Thompsons now mobilized with renewed purpose. If a man they had considered beyond redemption could change so profoundly, they reasoned, their own efforts to help needed to match that transformation. Mrs. Rodriguez transformed her small apartment into a command center for community support. A schedule appeared on her kitchen wall coordinating meals, childcare, and hospital visits. The neighbors took shifts ensuring Emily and Tommy never came home to an empty house, their refrigerator mysteriously staying full despite Malik's protests that they had enough now. The diner where Sarah worked became a hub of fundraising activities. Her co-workers organized weekly benefit dinners, with local restaurants donating supplies and community members paying far above the suggested prices for simple meals. The tip jar at the counter, labeled for Sarah, overflowed daily with anonymous contributions. At the hospital, the staff who remembered Sarah from her nursing days created a support network of their own. Extra pillows appeared in her room. Specialists happened to stop by during their rounds, and the cafeteria workers always made sure Malik had hot coffee during his long vigils at his mother's bedside. The local church opened its doors for a special prayer service, but it became more than just prayers. People brought envelopes containing whatever they could spare, a few dollars, grocery gift cards, handwritten offers of help. The pastor spoke about redemption and community, his words touching hearts that had grown hard with prejudice. Emily's art teacher organized an auction of student artwork, with proceeds going to a recovery fund for Sarah. The community center displayed the pieces, and anonymous buyers, many from the wealthy side of town, paid generously for children's drawings, especially Emily's hopeful portraits of her family. Tommy's baseball team wore Thompson Strong patches on their uniforms, and parents who had once avoided the family now cheered loudly when he played. The coach ensured he never missed a practice, personally driving him to and from games, creating moments of normalcy in an otherwise chaotic time. Robert continued his quiet support, but now others from the Hastings estate joined him. The staff who had once whispered suspicions about Malik organized their own collection, and Martha herself spent hours at the hospital, holding Sarah's hand and sharing gentle memories of their connection from years ago. The local pharmacy set up a fund to cover prescription costs. The physical therapy center offered pro bono services. Even Mr. Chen's supplier accidentally doubled all orders going to the Thompson family, ensuring they had everything they needed during Sarah's recovery. William Hastings matched every community donation, but more importantly, he used his influence to expedite insurance approvals and specialist appointments. His office became a clearinghouse for medical information and resources, his staff dedicated to smoothing Sarah's path to recovery. Local businesses put up "Get Well Sarah" signs in their windows. Children made cards in school. The newspaper that had once sensationalized Malik's arrest now ran positive stories about community unity and second chances, featuring the small acts of kindness that were becoming daily occurrences. Through it all, the Thompson family felt the shift from charity to genuine care. This wasn't just about money anymore, it was about a community recognizing its own capacity for both error and redemption. Each gesture, large or small, helped heal not just Sarah, but the social fabric that had been torn by prejudice and assumption. As Sarah grew stronger, so did the bonds between neighbors. The invisible lines that had divided the community began to blur and fade, replaced by connections forged in crisis and strengthened by compassion. What had started as a tragedy was transforming into something remarkable, a testament to the power of community and the possibility of change. The truth unfolded like the pages of an old book, each revelation adding depth to a story that spanned 15 years. Detective Miller sat at his desk late one night, spreading out the last pieces of evidence that completed the saga connecting the Thompsons and the Hastings family. The hospital records told the first chapter. Sarah Thompson, then a young nurse working double shifts to support her family, had been assigned to Martha Hastings during her difficult pregnancy with Andrew. The complications had been severe, and when other staff left at shift's end, Sarah had stayed, monitoring Martha through the critical hours, refusing to leave her patient's side. William Hastings' personal journals, voluntarily submitted during the investigation, revealed his own blind spots. Pages of entries showed his growing awareness of Andrew's instability, his desperate attempts to protect his family's reputation instead of addressing the real issues. The last entry before Michael's accident read simply, "What have I created in my eldest son?" Martha's therapy sessions, which she chose to make public, documented her struggle with guilt. She had seen the signs of Andrew's jealousy toward Michael, but had convinced herself that maternal love could bridge any gap. Her therapist's notes tracked her journey from denial to devastating clarity about her role in enabling Andrew's behavior. The security footage from the mansion, when viewed chronologically over months, showed the subtle ways Andrew had manipulated those around him. Small moments of cruelty toward staff, calculated displays of reform for his father, careful undermining of Malik, all building toward his ultimate plan to secure his position as sole heir. Robert's gardening journals provided the thread that tied everything together. His detailed observations of daily life at the estate had captured the small details others missed. He had documented Andrew's late-night activities, the suspicious meetings with Frank Wilson, the gradual escalation of his schemes against both Michael and Malik. Financial records revealed the extent of Andrew's preparations. He had been siphoning money from his trust fund for months, creating offshore accounts and establishing connections with people who could help him eliminate any threats to his inheritance. The theft of Martha's necklace had been just one piece of a larger plan. Sarah's old nursing supervisor emerged with additional context. She remembered Sarah's dedication during Martha's crisis, how she had worked unpaid hours to ensure her patient's survival. The supervisor had written a glowing recommendation when Sarah was forced to leave nursing to care for her young family, noting her exceptional character and sacrifice. The nurse who had been driving Michael when Andrew forced the car off the road provided her full statement. She described not just the accident, but the weeks leading up to it, Andrew's subtle intimidation, his questions about her schedule with Michael, his seemingly casual comments about tragic accidents involving infants. Detective Miller's investigation had uncovered a pattern of similar incidents at Andrew's previous schools and social circles. Former classmates came forward with stories of manipulation and retribution, painting a picture of a young man who had learned early to use privilege as a weapon. The community's response to Malik's arrest was dissected through social media posts and local news coverage, revealing how quickly people had accepted Andrew's narrative about the untrustworthy boy from the wrong side of town. The evidence showed how prejudice had made his frame-up not just possible but almost inevitable. Martha's discovery of her connection to Sarah through the old hospital records had shaken both families. The realization that Sarah had saved Andrew's life at birth, only to have him later attempt to destroy her son, added a layer of tragic irony to the entire situation. Each piece of evidence, when assembled, told a story larger than just crime and punishment. It was a narrative about privilege and poverty, about assumptions and prejudice, about the long arc of consequences that could span generations. The investigation had uncovered not just the truth about Andrew's crimes, but about the societal conditions that had made them possible. As Detective Miller closed the final file, he understood that this case would change more than just two families. It would force an entire community to confront its biases, to recognize how easily justice could be perverted by prejudice, and to acknowledge the complex web of connections that bound them all together. Sarah's recovery progressed slowly but steadily, each small improvement celebrated like a major victory. The hospital room that had once felt like a prison of machines and monitors gradually transformed into a space of healing and reconciliation. Martha Hastings became a frequent visitor, often bringing Michael, whose baby giggles seemed to have more therapeutic value than any medicine. The two mothers formed a bond that transcended their past connections. They would sit together for hours, sometimes talking, sometimes just holding hands in comfortable silence. Martha shared stories about the night Sarah had saved her life, memories that Sarah had kept tucked away as simply part of her nursing duties. Their shared experiences of motherhood, of fear and hope, created a bridge between their different worlds. Malik returned to the Hastings garden, not as an employee but as family. Robert welcomed him with open arms, and together they restored the flowers that had suffered in his absence. The old gardener's patient wisdom helped Malik process his experiences, each planted seed representing a step toward healing. The roses they tended became symbols of resilience, blooming despite the harsh seasons they had endured. Emily's art flourished again, her drawings now filled with vibrant colors and hopeful scenes. She spent afternoons in Sarah's hospital room, sketching her mother's recovery journey. The walls became a gallery of healing, documenting each milestone: Sarah's first steps in physical therapy, her first time sitting up unassisted, her first real smile after the surgery. Tommy found his voice again, chattering endlessly to his mother about baseball games and school adventures. His toy cars still lined the hospital windowsill, but now they seemed less like guardians and more like cheerleaders, celebrating each step of her recovery. The nurses would often find him demonstrating his pitching technique for Sarah, his enthusiasm bringing life to the sterile room. William Hastings made quiet amends in his own way. He established a healthcare fund for families facing medical crises, ensuring that no one in their community would have to choose between treatment and survival. The fund's first beneficiaries were former co-workers of Sarah's from her nursing days who had fallen on hard times. The community's healing matched Sarah's physical recovery. Former critics became supporters, prejudices dissolved in the face of shared humanity. The invisible barrier between Cedar Street and Highland Avenue began to fade as people realized that zip codes couldn't define character or worth. Robert's Garden became a gathering place for both families. On warm afternoons, Sarah would sit in a comfortable chair while Martha served tea, their children playing together on the manicured lawn. The roses seemed to bloom more vibrantly, as if responding to the genuine laughter and connection that now filled the space. Detective Miller visited occasionally, not as an investigator but as a friend. He would bring updates about the changes in police training and community relations that had resulted from their case. Each policy reform, each new initiative to combat prejudice in law enforcement, marked another step toward systemic healing. The diner where Sarah had worked became a symbol of community transformation. The regular customers who had once shunned her now greeted her return visits with genuine warmth. The tip jar that had collected funds for her recovery stayed on the counter, repurposed to help other families in crisis. Even the courthouse, where justice had finally prevailed, showed signs of change. Judge Patterson used their case in seminars about bias in the justice system, ensuring that future decisions would be made with greater awareness of how privilege and prejudice could distort the truth. The healing wasn't just physical or social, it was deeply personal for everyone involved. Each family member, each community member had to confront their own biases and assumptions. The process was sometimes uncomfortable, but necessary, like cleaning a wound before it could properly heal. In the end, the healing that began in Sarah's hospital room rippled outward, touching lives far beyond their immediate circle. The story of two families, divided by circumstance but united by acts of courage and redemption, became a testament to the possibility of change and the power of genuine connection to heal not just bodies, but hearts and communities as well. As Sarah regained her strength, a new vision began to take shape in the hearts of both families. William Hastings approached Malik one evening in the garden, where the young man was teaching Emily and Tommy about nurturing seedlings. "We've been thinking," he said, watching the siblings work together. "This estate has too much unused space." The Hastings-Thompson Foundation was born from that conversation. The empty east wing of the mansion was transformed into a community center, offering education and support programs for underprivileged youth. Sarah, once recovered, took charge of the healthcare initiative, using her nursing experience to bridge the gap between medical services and community needs. Malik found his calling in the Foundation's mentorship program. His experience had given him unique insight into the challenges faced by young people from struggling families. He worked with local schools to identify students with potential who needed support, creating opportunities he wished he'd had before his own ordeal. The garden, under Robert's continued guidance, became an outdoor classroom. Children from both sides of town learned about growth, patience, and nurturing life alongside each other. The old gardener's eyes would mist over watching young hands plant seeds together, social barriers dissolving in the shared soil. Martha focused on early childhood programs, inspired by watching Michael grow alongside the community center children. She established a daycare center that allowed working parents to pursue education and career opportunities without worrying about childcare costs. The sound of children's laughter filled the once quiet halls of Hastings Manor. Emily's art program became one of the Foundation's most popular initiatives. She worked with local artists to create workshops for children who couldn't afford art supplies. Her own experiences with art as therapy during difficult times informed the program's approach to healing through creative expression. Tommy's baseball team became part of a larger sports program, ensuring that no child would be excluded from activities due to financial constraints. The Foundation provided equipment, uniforms, and transportation, breaking down the barriers that had once divided young athletes by zip code. The community response exceeded all expectations. Local businesses offered apprenticeships, professionals volunteered as tutors, and families from both sides of town found themselves working together toward common goals. The Foundation became a model for other communities struggling with similar divisions. William used his business connections to secure funding and support, but insisted that the Foundation's leadership reflect the community it served. The board included people from all walks of life, their diverse perspectives, ensuring that programs truly met community needs. The most powerful impact came from the simple act of bringing people together. Children who might never have met became friends. Parents who might have judged each other found common ground. The Foundation's programs created spaces where genuine connections could form across social and economic lines. Sarah often stood at the window of her old hospital room, now part of a clinic providing free medical care to underserved families. The view had changed. Where she had once seen only parking lots and concrete, she now saw gardens, playgrounds, and people from all walks of life coming together with purpose. The Foundation's work attracted attention from other cities facing similar challenges. Delegations would visit to learn how two families had transformed personal tragedy into community triumph. But for those involved, the real success was measured in smaller moments: a child's first art show, a parent's graduation, a family receiving needed medical care. The unused spaces of privilege became bridges to opportunity, and the pain of the past transformed into purpose for the future. The Foundation stood as living proof that healing was possible not just for individuals, but for entire communities willing to confront their divisions and work together toward change. 1 year after Sarah's release from the hospital, both families gathered in the Hastings garden for a celebration that would have seemed impossible months earlier. The roses were in full bloom, their fragrance mingling with the scent of grilled food and the sound of children's laughter. Sarah, now fully recovered and glowing with renewed health, sat in the place of honor at the long table set up among the flower beds. She had returned to nursing part-time at the Foundation's clinic, finding joy in helping others while maintaining balance in her life. The lines of exhaustion that had once marked her face had softened, replaced by the gentle confidence of someone who had survived the storm. Emily and Tommy raced around the garden with Michael, who had grown into a toddler with boundless energy. Their games knew no social boundaries, their laughter a testament to children's natural ability to forge connections that adults often complicated. Emily's art portfolio, filled with bright paintings of their extended family, sat proudly displayed on an easel near the gathering. Malik moved between both families with easy grace, equally comfortable helping Robert tend to the roses and discussing Foundation business with William. The haunted look that detention had left in his eyes had faded, replaced by the quiet strength of someone who had found his purpose. He wore the garden dirt on his hands like badges of honor, proof of honest work and growth. William and Martha watched their young son play with the Thompson children, their hearts full of gratitude for the twisting path that had brought them all together. Michael would grow up knowing both privilege and responsibility, understanding the importance of character over circumstance. The lessons learned from Andrew's choices would shape a different future for their youngest. In the prison visiting room, Andrew had begun showing real change. His weekly sessions with a therapist had helped him understand the roots of his actions, and his letters to both families, once full of justifications, now carried genuine remorse. While he could never undo the harm he had caused, his commitment to funding the Foundation's work offered a path toward meaningful amends. Robert surveyed his garden with quiet satisfaction, watching the families interact as naturally as the different flowers he had taught them to tend. His patient cultivation of truth had yielded a harvest more beautiful than mere blooms. It had grown understanding, connection, and healing. The neighborhood children who once pressed their faces against the estate's gates now ran freely through its gardens, attending programs and classes that bridged the divide between Cedar Street and Highland Avenue. The Foundation's success had proven that community healing was possible when people chose connection over division. Sarah's former co-workers from the diner served as Foundation volunteers, their initial skepticism transformed into enthusiastic support. The restaurant itself had become a popular lunch spot for Foundation participants, its walls decorated with Emily's artwork and photos of community success stories. Tommy's baseball team practiced on the newly constructed Foundation field, where children from all backgrounds learn not just sports but teamwork and mutual respect. His coach had become a mentor to many young athletes, ensuring that no child felt excluded due to financial constraints. The medical staff who had cared for Sarah during her crisis now partnered with the Foundation's health initiatives, offering their services to families who might otherwise go without care. The hospital room where she had fought for her life had been renovated into a comfortable waiting area for families facing similar challenges. As the sun began to set over the garden party, casting long shadows across the carefully tended flower beds, both families gathered for a group photo. The picture would capture more than just smiling faces, it would document a transformation. Two families, once divided by circumstance and prejudice, had become one extended family bound by love, understanding, and shared purpose. Martha held Michael on her lap while Sarah sat beside her, their hands clasped in the friendship that had grown from their shared history. William stood proud behind them, his hand on Malik's shoulder, while Emily and Tommy posed with their latest art projects and sports trophies. Robert took his place among them, the quiet gardener whose wisdom had helped truth and justice flower. The photo would hang in the Foundation's main hall, a reminder that even the deepest wounds could heal when tended with care, understanding, and the unwavering belief in the possibility of change. 5 years after the events that had shaken their community, Cedar Street and Highland Avenue were almost unrecognizable. The invisible barrier that had once divided the neighborhoods had dissolved, replaced by a vibrant tapestry of connection and mutual support. The Hastings-Thompson Foundation stood at the heart of this transformation, its programs weaving new patterns of understanding across once rigid social lines. The old community center, once abandoned and boarded up, now buzzed with activity from dawn to dusk. Children from both neighborhoods attended after-school programs together, their friendships making mockery of the prejudices that had once kept them apart. The walls, once gray and deteriorating, bloomed with murals painted by Emily and her young art students, depicting scenes of unity and hope. Local businesses that had once viewed Cedar Street residents with suspicion now participated enthusiastically in the Foundation's apprenticeship program. Chen's Corner Store had expanded into a proper market, employing young people from both neighborhoods and serving as a gathering place for the entire community. The diner where Sarah had worked became a popular spot for Foundation meetings, its booths filled with people from all walks of life planning new initiatives together. The changes went beyond mere appearances. Property values in Cedar Street had stabilized as community investment increased, but unlike typical gentrification, original residents weren't pushed out. The Foundation's housing initiative, guided by William's business acumen and Sarah's understanding of community needs, ensured that development benefited everyone. The annual Garden Festival, hosted on the Hastings estate grounds, became a symbol of the new community spirit. Families from both neighborhoods shared food, music, and stories, while children played together among Robert's carefully tended flowers. The event culminated each year with a lantern release, each light representing a hope for the future or a prejudice overcome. Education saw perhaps the most dramatic transformation. The local schools, once starkly divided by zip code, now shared resources and programs. The Foundation Scholarship Fund, named in honor of both families, helped promising students from all backgrounds pursue higher education. Several of its first recipients had returned to work in the community, creating a cycle of positive change. The police department, influenced by Detective Miller's advocacy, implemented new training programs focused on community engagement and bias recognition. Officers regularly participated in foundation events, building relationships with residents from all neighborhoods. The change was reflected in statistics showing decreased tensions and increased trust between law enforcement and the community. Health disparities began to narrow as the Foundation's medical initiatives expanded. The clinic, where Sarah now worked part-time, provided essential services to families who had previously gone without care. Regular health fairs and education programs helped residents take charge of their well-being, while a mobile medical unit reached those who couldn't come to the clinic. Religious and community organizations that had once stayed within their comfortable boundaries now collaborated regularly. The pastor who had initially shunned the Thompsons became a vocal advocate for social justice, using his pulpit to challenge long-held prejudices and promote understanding. Even the physical landscape reflected the change. New parks and green spaces, developed with input from both communities, provided gathering places for residents. Robert's gardening programs had inspired a network of community gardens, transforming vacant lots into productive spaces that brought neighbors together. The media narrative about the area had shifted dramatically. Where once there had been stories about crime and division, now there were features about community success stories, innovative programs, and the power of reconciliation. Other cities sent delegations to study the Hastings-Thompson model of community transformation. The Foundation's youth leadership program, led by Malik, became particularly influential in sustaining these changes. Young people from both neighborhoods worked together on community projects, developing skills and relationships that would ensure the transformation continued into the next generation. Local government, seeing the success of these grassroots changes, began incorporating community input more meaningfully into planning decisions. The city council chamber, once a battleground between competing interests, became a forum for collaborative problem-solving. The most profound change, however, was in the daily interactions between neighbors. The suspicion and fear that had once characterized cross-neighborhood encounters had been replaced by genuine warmth and connection. People who might never have spoken now shared meals, celebrated together, and supported each other through life's challenges. 10 years after Malik ran toward a burning car to save a baby, he stood at a podium in the Foundation's main hall, addressing a new class of scholarship recipients. The room was filled with young faces from both sides of town, all carrying dreams that no longer seemed impossible. "Our story," he began, looking at his mother Sarah sitting proudly in the front row, "isn't just about overcoming adversity. It's about the transformative power of truth, forgiveness, and the courage to see beyond our assumptions." His voice carried the weight of experience, but also the lightness of hard-won wisdom. Emily, now a successful art therapist, worked with children processing their own traumas. Her gallery showcased artwork from both sides of town, telling stories of struggle and triumph through young eyes. Tommy had become a youth baseball coach, ensuring that every child, regardless of background, had a chance to play. Robert, his hair now completely white, but his hands still strong from gardening, continued to mentor young people in the art of patience and growth. His garden had become a living classroom where children learned that the most beautiful blooms often came from the most challenging conditions. The Hastings family had been transformed as well. William and Martha devoted themselves to expanding the Foundation's reach, while Michael, now a teenager, worked alongside Malik in youth outreach programs. Their family's story became a powerful testament to the possibility of change and redemption. Andrew, having served his time and completed extensive therapy, worked remotely for the foundation, using his business skills to help other families avoid the pitfalls of privilege and entitlement. His journey from darkness to redemption became part of the curriculum in local schools, teaching children about responsibility and consequences. Sarah's clinic had grown into a full medical center, serving both communities with dignity and compassion. She often shared her story with nursing students, emphasizing how small acts of kindness could ripple through generations. The night she had saved Martha Hastings and the day Malik had saved Michael had created a circle of care that continued to expand. The foundation's success sparked similar initiatives across the country, as other communities sought to heal their own divisions. Malik and his family traveled occasionally to share their story, but their hearts remained rooted in the garden where truth had first bloomed. "Look around you," Malik continued in his speech. "These walls once divided us. Now they unite us. Every one of you carries the power to transform your community, to choose connection over division, understanding over assumption, love over fear." But as he spoke, the late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the photographs that lined the walls, images capturing a decade of transformation. Children from both neighborhoods playing together, families sharing meals, gardens blooming where concrete had cracked, all testament to the power of human connection. "Our greatest strength," he concluded, "lies not in our ability to avoid adversity, but in our courage to face it together. Every one of you is proof that when we look beyond surfaces, when we tend to each other with care and patience, remarkable things can grow." The applause that followed wasn't just for his words, but for the living truth they represented. In the garden outside, Robert's roses still bloomed, their beauty enhanced by the knowledge of what it had taken to grow them. Like the community they represented, they had flourished not despite their challenges, but because of the care, patience, and understanding that had helped them overcome them. As the sun set over the transformed neighborhood, its light touched both sides of the old divide equally, illuminating a community that had learned the most valuable lesson of all, that the walls we build between us are nothing compared to the bridges we can create together. Your thoughts on this story of redemption and transformation matter to us. If this tale of hope, healing, and community touched your heart, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel for more powerful storytelling. Share this video with friends and family who might need a reminder that change is possible and forgiveness can transform lives. Your likes and comments help us continue creating content that bridges divides and spreads understanding. Join our growing community of storytellers and believers in the power of human connection. Together we can make a difference, one story at a time.